Welcome. This is going to be a show that you'll want to remember for a long time. It goes back to George Washington, and my guest is Ray Lorber. And Ray has spent 12 years on this book. I used to see Ray every week on a Wednesday for about 6 months, and he was always working on something, not this, but he has been working 12 years on this book. And tell us why you devoted 12 years to George.
I retired, and upon retirement, I decided to study the founders and the founders of America. And in my reading, I first started out with reading John Adams' book by McCullough, and then I followed that with my favorite founder, Alexander Hamilton, by Ron Chernoff, excuse me. In the books, I noticed that frequently they talked about Providence. Providence was saving them, and they knew America would win the battle against Great Britain because they were right. And Providence always supported those who were right. And I noticed they referred to George Washington about Providence frequently. So the next book I read, the third book, was His Excellency by John Ellis, Joseph Ellis. And throughout that book, I noticed that George Washington's providence was a private providence. It was his providence. It wasn't a general providence. And Providence was a person, was a God who protected you and saved you and guided you through life. And George believed that he was destined to accomplish great things, and that Providence was protecting him so that he would survive a very challenging life.
And this started early. What would be a first occurrence of how Providence saved him?
Much to my surprise in my research, Washington was a very unhealthy person. He had a lot of diseases he experienced. At the age of 17, he experienced malaria. This is during this period of time when malaria was one of the largest killers of people in America. At the age of 18, he experienced smallpox, which is a big killer also. At the age of 19, he had tuberculosis, 3 diseases that normally people would die with. He did not. He's a very strong, very athletic person. And at the age of 21, he signed up to take a journey, a trek, deep into the western parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania in search of the French commandant, to tell the French commandant that he was building forts in British territory and he was to cease doing that. This trek was in the middle of winter. He experienced a lot of blizzards. The horses had to stop the trek because they couldn't survive. So he did the final part of the trek on land. A very strong personality. A very strong person, but this is a guy who just had 3 devastating diseases and survived them, and now he's out taking this big trek.
And this is 1,000 miles round trip, 1,000 miles.
Correct.
And I'd like our audience to just listen for a second, because we're going to ask them the question, what you think, what you found out was the median age of death at the end of the 18th century. So don't say it for a second. I want our audience to think about this, the median age of death at the end or towards the end of the 18th century. Okay, you thought about it?
It's 16 years old. Typically a person, the median age was 16. There's a lot of death among the babies, younger people. That's why I brought the median age down to 16.
What did you find out about him as an outstanding leader in this time?
One of Washington's characteristics was that he had what they called character during that period of time. A very moral person. And I would like to read something here for a second. What's one sentence put out by Gordon Wood in Revolutionary Characters. Washington became a great man and was acclaimed as a classical hero because of the way he conducted himself during times of temptation. As an example, when he, at the end of the Revolutionary War, he returned his sword to Congress. Napoleon was amazed that a person would do that. He just conquered the British and is giving his sword back to Congress. Another example is when he became president. There's a large demand for him to be a monarch, and he refused to be a monarch. He was there at elected basis, and he served his term, and he was finished. A very moral person, and that was his major thing I learned about Washington in my readings, is his character. Character meant a lot to him. He during that period of time in our country, character was critical.
He spent a lot of time on letters, and these are magnificent letters. I wish our presidents of late could emulate in such a sense. I mean, to read those letters, which were written in adverse circumstances most of the time. You're on the road or you're in the wilderness.
Yes.
And they're beautiful letters. They're rhetorically presented.
He was not very highly educated, like maybe 7th, 8th grade. His father passed away at that time, and he could not get any further education. His older brothers had gone to England for their training, but he was unable to do that. You can notice in reading his letters, in the beginning, his spelling was pretty bad. It was atrocious.
Loose and lose, loose and lose.
But as he went through life, he was a student continually. And towards the end, his letters were fantastic as far as the quality of the grammar and the spelling. But it was fun trying to work your way through the letters in the beginning.
But he's so diplomatic in his letters that he may say for 3 pages, well, these are the reasons why I won't do this. But however, if you give me a little chance or leeway on my terms, I might consider this. So these letters are very diplomatically cagey in one sense, as Machiavelli would say, but I mean, they have a purpose, and he develops that, as you say. He's self-educated and gets on and accomplishes more and more with year and year.
He's showing his character again. At one time, there were several generals who were trying to remove Washington during the Revolutionary War while he was at Fort.
All right, you got me here. We'll go on. We'll go on.
Yes, and he realized he got a letter in the mail that they were doing that. It was an undercover letter, and he didn't do a thing about it. He let it go, and they visited him at Valley Forge. There we go. And he just let it go, and they realized that he had the letter, and he realized that he knew what they were trying to do, but he didn't make a move on it. And basically, that was his character coming out. He didn't want to do things in difficult situations that would be embarrassing to him later.
There's one example I want to get through before I go somewhere else here. You mentioned Providence, and there's a situation. I think of Mel Gibson's film The Patriot for some reason or other when I'm putting these together. But anyway, there's a situation with letters to back it up of a British sniper who could hit a page or a plate at 100 yards easily in 5 places, sees 2 figures, and decides not to shoot. One of them is George. Later on, he's told that was George Washington. You're a British sniper. You could have killed him. And he said, I wouldn't have done it. And I just say to myself, this is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. It's just one instance of how Providence, even though he's a sitting duck, literally.
Yes. That was Captain Ferguson. And he had a repeating rifle.
Yeah.
He can knock off 6 shots in a minute.
Yeah.
One of the very few organizations, it was a company of people who had Ferguson rifles. General Howe later banned repeating rifles. It just didn't fit fighting during the Revolutionary War. But he's eyeballing. He didn't know it was George Washington, but it was the description of him. And he was going to shoot him, and Washington stared him down, looked at him eyeball to eyeball, turned his horse around and rode away.
He wasn't wearing customary
he
garb, though.
He dressed to the hilt.
Yeah,
As you can see the cover of my book, the General Washington and all generals really dressed well.
I thought he was dressing as a hussar that day, or the gentleman with him was.
They looked like that.
Looked like that. Okay.
Yes, they weren't hussars. No.
No. Listen, this is a proud day. Your book is published today.
That's right.
Is that right?
Today's the day that got released.
This is a proof. So today is the day, but this is the proof. But tell it, you must be proud. It's like having a baby of the family. Let me see, about 6 ounces? No, 1 pound. 1 pound. No diapers.
It's 12 years.
12 years.
That's how heavy the book is.
That's all right. It's a long pregnancy. Tell us about the cover. It's a magnificent cover.
This is a picture of Washington during the Monmouth Courthouse battle. This is a very significant battle, and it was the last time that George Washington got into a battle, and it drove the British out of northern America. They proceeded to the south after that, down in North Carolina, etc. But in the north, they were defeated, and they didn't come back again. The British were leaving Philadelphia, marching across New Jersey, going to New York City. And Washington was following them, having left Valley Forge and following them across country. And the last day before they got to embark to New York City, he attacked. And General Lee was leading the attack. Only a few hours into the battle, General Lee decides to retreat. And Washington is following through with the rest of the troops. And he comes upon General Lee going the wrong direction. And Washington, for the first time in history, lost it. He let General Lee have it. Couldn't conceive why you'd be retreating. Then he took charge of the battle. And he was in the middle of it. He always got right in the middle of the battle. And he came upon a captain, whose name is Lucy right now, and said, listen, the British are charging. You got to stand in front of this fence and stop them, have your company stop them from going any further while I set up my ammunition and my cannons on the hills around you, and then we can stop them. And the captain with his Captain Ramsey and his company stood there in front of the attacking British, the best the British had, and all of them got killed, except Ramsey. He only had quite a few bayonet wounds in his body, but he survived. And Howe was so impressed with him stopping the British that Howe, after he captured him, released him to go back to the American forces. When Washington had the forces organized and attacked, they defeated them, totally defeated. Thousands of British soldiers were killed. And that night, Americans slept on the battlefield, expecting to continue the battle the next day. But the British left. They went back to New York that evening.
This was a chess game in some ways, those final months, if you want, before this battle, because they surmised that the British might do this or might do this or might do this. And he organized his cabinet of generals and said, tell me individually what you think we should do. And then reviewed each general's suggestions and then put them together. And this is a wonderful way of doing it. I mean, looking at it and saying, now, if you were such and such, Cornwallis or whatever, what would you do? Reviewed it and then acted on it.
Cornwallis is on the wrong side.
I know that, but I mean about Cornwallis. I mean, how
Yes.
would we handle this?
Okay,
And how,
yes.
how I should say.
You read my book.
I
all the
did
way through.
indeed, every page.
That was really a battle between General Lee and General Washington. Lee wanted to be in charge.
Yeah, yeah.
And Washington didn't like the idea of Lee being in charge. So he really wanted to have Lafayette in charge. And Lee was superior in ranking. And he argued with Lafayette, and he didn't want to attack the British. He did not want to attack the British. He thought it would be a bad move. And Lafayette wanted to attack the British. And so Lee won. He was placed in charge, but he retreated. So Lafayette was able to attack after that.
One of the things that impressed me with George was his knowledge of arithmetic. It seems silly, but as an early boy, he loved arithmetic. He became a surveyor. He knew how to measure land. And it seems to me that could only have helped him as a general in knowing the layout of the land or the lay of the land wherever he went, whether it's the 1,000-mile round trip or whether it's the final battle. He knew the land and how to measure it.
Being a surveyor, he got that job because of his affiliation with the Fairfaxes. William Fairfax, the patriarch of the family, really liked George a lot and became his patron and kind of helped George through life. And he gave George his first job as a surveyor. George had traveled around with William Fairfax, the son, and became good friends with him. They traveled throughout Virginia doing surveys for the Fairfax property. And that's where he learned how to do surveying. And he became a surveyor, got his license to be a surveyor very quickly. He didn't go through the normal training and normal testing that you do in that period of time to become a surveyor. So he had some pull. And also, because of his contact with William Fairfax, he was the one selected to take the travel to see the commandant, French commandant, to tell him to get out of British territory.
He went abroad only once, and that was to Barbados.
Yes, that's correct. No, he didn't. Yes, he went to Barbados. Yes.
To help
He was
a
with
half-brother.
He was with his half-brother,
Yeah.
Lawrence, who had tuberculosis. And they thought they could go to a warmer country and recover from tuberculosis. And while they're in Barbados, he gets smallpox. And the brother moves on to Bermuda. And he had to return back to Virginia on a ship, having recovered from smallpox very quickly.
Now, smallpox leads me into one of his tactics of inoculating his troops. Tell us about that.
He was the first general to ever do that. And the major surgeon Shippen, who was in charge of the military health, was encouraging Washington to get the troops inoculated because the troops from the South would bring smallpox into the troops in the North.
Not accidentally.
No, well, no, it was accidental. They didn't do it on purpose.
Well, the British were bringing in.
Well, they were doing that on purpose.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
The British would give smallpox to the slaves and send slaves back to Washington,
Right.
which was horrible to the slaves and to the Americans. But Washington established a ruling that before you could be active in the military, you had to have a smallpox inoculation. And it was very devastating. A lot of people got very, very sick, but they would survive usually. Most of them did, and then they could go into the military.
We should say there's a difference between inoculation and vaccination, because the vaccination is much later in time. Jenner doesn't invent that until much later.
Yes.
But inoculation would be what? What would be the procedure?
I'm not too sure of that. I didn't really cover, that. It wasn't fun. They didn't like doing that.
But it saved lives, obviously.
Oh, yes, it worked well. Yeah.
Now, you've done the book. The book is out today. Where do you go from here?
There's something else that Washington did, talking about making steps that had never been done before. He had chaplains. He was the first army that had chaplains. Washington, although he certainly believed in providence, he certainly believed that somebody was watching over him. That was Masonic training. He was not a religious person. He didn't take communion in the church, and they wanted him to do badly. The minister did, but he didn't participate. But he did bring in chaplains, and he would have Sunday services for his troops. Very unique for a military organization to have a chaplain.
He didn't belong to a party, a political party.
He did not.
And
he was against political parties.
Good. And then he doesn't belong to a particular religion. So he's independent.
Well, he was Anglican.
And Anglican?
Anglican,
okay,
yes.
all right,
Yeah.
okay, good. So let's go back to this.
His wife made him go to church on Sunday.
Martha,
Martha.
the rich widow.
Yes.
All right, who survives him by 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the worst things that I believe that Washington ever did, the poor lady, when he passed away in his will, he said, after Martha dies, my slaves will be free. So Martha's